In this video, I want to offer some reflections on the modern day debate I did yesterday with Sam Ness on my side, the side of latent truth. And then on the other side, Tom Jump and Matt Dillahunty, and we were arguing the question, is belief in God rational, or are there sufficient reasons, was actually the question, are there sufficient reasons to believe in God, or is there sufficient reason to believe in God? Now, the first thing I just want to note is the way that Sam and I interpreted that question is that it could be interpreted with respect either to what we call proper basicality or non-basicality. So in other words, a proper basicality is the idea that a belief can be justified, rational, and could be a vector of knowledge simply on the occasion of forming the belief in a particular circumstance. So for example, if you look out the window, and as it is today, you see that it's raining out. There's no reasoning process, no discursive process by which you then conclude, therefore it is raining out. Rather, you have the experience of seeing that it is raining and you immediately form the belief that it is raining outside. And so that's would be an example of a properly basic belief. Formed under the right circumstances, it could be rational, justified, and provide you with knowledge if it is in fact raining outside. Now, a properly non-basic belief is one that you reason to. It's the conclusion of a discursive process of reasoning. So I made the distinction here. Properly basic are like axioms in mathematics, and properly non-basic are like theorems. And so to say, are there sufficient reasons to believe in God, or is there sufficient reason to believe in God, is a way of asking, first of all, can you form God by way of an appropriate ground or a properly basic belief under the right circumstances? And then can you form it through a process of discursive reasoning in a way that is rational and justified? In each case, can you form it properly basic or not properly non-basic? And Sam, we decided would defend the idea that Christianity, or theism, I should say, belief in God can be properly non-basic. So you could reason to it as the conclusion of an argument and be rational, justified in doing so. And I argue the first part, that it can be rational or justified simply on occasion of having particular experiences. Those experiences can provide the grounds for belief in God. Now, here's where I get to the point I want to talk about in this video, because often what Christian epistemologists have done when they argue that first part is, I think, under the influence of Alvin Plantinga, they focus in particular on the idea of a sensus divinitatis, saying it in a very pretentious way, the sensus divinitatis. So the idea that we could have a cognitive faculty in which we can perceive the divine or sense the divine, we can sense God in some way, and based upon that sensory input, then just as I look out at the window today and I see it's raining out and I form the immediate rational justified belief that it is raining, so I experience in some particular circumstance the presence of God, the love of God, the comfort of God, something like that. And I form the immediate belief, well, God loves me, or God cares for me. Now, one interesting detail about that, by the way, is that belief in God as such is not typically understood to be properly basic by way of the sensus divinitatis. Rather, the idea is that particular beliefs about God are those which are properly basic. And so then you can infer God's existence by implication from those beliefs. So technically, we're not saying typically belief in God itself is that which is properly basic, but rather the existence of God is the implication of that which is properly basic. So in the same way that when I look out the window, I don't form the belief that weather exists or rainy days exist, and therefore conclude this is a rainy day. Rather, I look out the window and see it's raining today, and an implication of that is that there are rainy days. In the same way, you might have the properly basic belief, God loves me, and based upon that belief, by implication, it follows that God exists. And so that's actually the logic of proper basicality. But in terms of the sensus divinitatis in particular, so this was an idea that Plantinga got from John Calvin, of course, who talks about how we could have this cognitive process. And I agree. I mean, I think that that's perfectly fine. We have, like, people often think, oh, well, we have 5 senses, right? And so now you want to add a 6th sense. Actually, we've got a lot more than 5 senses going on here. So we have a sense, an ability to proprioceptive. If you don't know what that is, proprioception is the ability to have an immediate intuitive knowledge of the extension of your body in space. So if your ability to proprioceptive begins to decline, as it may, let's say in older age, you start bumping into things, for example, or you might trip. But your ability to proprioceptive is your ability to navigate space without hitting things. And that's not simply among the 5 senses. That's an additional ability that we have. Another ability that I think we have is an ability to perceive danger. And that's not simply one of the 5 senses. Gavin de Becker, some years ago, he wrote a book, probably 25 years ago. It was a bestseller at the time called The Gift of Fear. And he made a point in that book that I never forgot. He says that, well, first of all, the whole theme of the book is to tap into this primal instinct or ability we have to intuit when there's danger and to act accordingly. And he says the problem is that we live in civil society and we're often trained to sublimate that impulse to detect danger because we want to be civil and civilized. And he says that's a big mistake. So he gives an example that always stuck with me. A woman is about to get onto an elevator. Doors open. She sees a guy standing in there looking back at her, and there's just something off. Just doesn't seem right. And what Gavin de Becker says is, most cases, what she will do is she will sublimate and she'll push down and ignore her inclination, that's her sense that there's something wrong here. And she'll get on the elevator. And he says, which other species, which other animal would do that? Would get into a closed space with a potential predator when they sense danger? Only human beings. And so he says, we need to learn to listen to the gift of fear, the ability that we have to intuit fear. Now, is this sense that we can detect danger a distinct sense? Well, it's not simply sense perception. Right? It's something else is going on here. It's not simply smell, touch, sight. There does seem to be an additional ability to extract data from the environment that is going on there. So I think we need to recognize that our ability, or our senses, may be much more diverse than we initially recognize. I'm a big fan, and I actually mentioned this yesterday in our, actually this was yesterday we recorded a debrief, Sam Ness and I, after the debate, and I mentioned this as well in that debate, or in that video, that I'm a fan of supernatural horror films. I despise slasher films, but I like supernatural stuff that kind of explores the liminal dimensions of human existence. And one theme, of course, in many of those films is that certain people have a particular ability to perceive aspects of reality, like seeing dead people. If you remember The Sixth Sense, I see dead people. Or The Shining, right? Danny has the shine. The film The Gift is another one where it centers on a woman played by Kate Blanchett who has a ability to like a clairvoyance. And that's an interesting question. Some people have that kind of ability, or do we all have it to some degree and some people have it more? Those are interesting questions. So we could have all sorts of cognitive faculties or doxastic processes, belief-forming actions that give us properly basic belief about the world. And the Sensus Divinitatis could very well be one of those also. And another thing that Plantinga, a point he makes about the Sensus Divinitatis, is that if God exists, then it's very likely that we have some cognitive faculty like the Sensus Divinitatis, because God would want to furnish us with immediate, direct, intuitive, perceptual knowledge of God. And so he would equip us with that, just like he equipped us with ability to see, smell, taste, and so on. And of course, then there's a whole conversation, well, then why does the Sensus Divinitatis not provide us with more reliable universal information? And that's when you get into the conversation about what Plantinga and others have called, quote, the noetic effects of sin. In other words, the fact certainly that in the Christian story, the Sensus Divinitatis is not eradicated, but it's damaged. So you'll sometimes, it's like a radio that can sometimes pick up stations and sometimes not. And you get into that conversation. And that's all fine. I think that that's legitimate. And if people have a Sensus Divinitatis that is functioning to a particular degree, then they could indeed form properly basic beliefs about God just by perceiving, sensing God's presence in their life and so on. But I don't appeal to the Sensus Divinitatis when I am in debates and I want to argue about proper basicality in Christian belief. And there's a good reason why. There's a good reason why I didn't talk about it in my debate with Matt Dillahunty and Tom Jump. And the reason I didn't talk about it is because you open yourself up to the charge of magic. You see, when you talk about the Sensus Divinitatis, what you're talking about is a cognitive faculty that is outside of that person's explanatory toolbox. Let's put it that way. So they'll likely to be dismissive of it, especially if you're dealing with people like Matt Dillahunty, who does not take, I mean, both Matt and Tom Jump yesterday said they believe there's literally no evidence at all for God's existence, which frankly is just a crazy position to take. It's the question of God's existence is one of those fundamental perennial questions in the history of philosophy. To claim that for one of the fundamental perennial questions of philosophy, there's literally zero evidence for one side of the question is just laughable. But what you have to recognize then, if you're going to interact with a person like Matt or a person like Tom, then if you pull out the Sensus Divinitatis, they're going to be dismissive of it. They're going to talk, well, this is magic, as I said. More specifically, they would probably, I don't know if they would use the term or not, but they would think likely in terms of special pleading, that you're trying to invoke some particular new thing to make your case, and they would probably think it's ad hoc. That would go along with special pleading. So you're kind of after the fact. It's kind of like painting the target. Look for another way that people can form properly basic beliefs about God. And the way that they do that is through a mundane cognitive process, testimony. You see, every human being forms a vast bulk of what we believe about the world going back to our earliest formative years as infants and toddlers through testimony. Other people telling us truths about the world or things about the world they believe to be true. Now, there is in philosophy, in the epistemology of testimony, a fundamental principle, and it is called the principle of testimony. And according to the principle of testimony, you accept the testimony of other individuals. It's rational and justified to do so unless you have some overriding reason not to accept it. Now, of course, that also allows for all degrees of some degree of acceptance being provisional versus some degree being very strong. But let me just give you a simple example that I gave in the debate yesterday. The belief that the restaurant is 6 blocks west of where we are now. That is a belief that one could form by way of testimony if one asks someone for directions to the restaurant in the street. And that guy, he says, oh, the restaurant's 6 blocks to the west. Actually, I remember when I lived in London, England, I lived there for a couple years, and by the middle of the second year, I knew the city, at least downtown, pretty well, because I lived downtown. And an American came up to me in the West End and asked me, how do I get to Whistle Down the Wind, which was one of the big musicals playing in the West End at the time. And so I said something very much like that. I said, oh, okay, it's 5 blocks down this way and then turn right at so-and-so street. And I felt so proud of myself that I could confidently give directions to a West End musical. I felt like a true Londoner in that moment. Now that person was justified in accepting my testimony at that moment because I appeared to be a credible witness who knew what I was talking about, and she proceeded based on that testimony. Now, of course, if she was asking me about hydrochloroquine and can I take hydrochloroquine to stave off the coronavirus? And I'm just some guy in the street. Well, that would not be justified, right? Because I would lack the credentials for her to accept my testimony. But in the context of just getting directions to the theater, I can give her justified belief. And so she can form it based upon my testimony. So that's how testimony functions. And in the debate, I argued that you could form belief in God. And the fact that most people do. I mean, 95% of people, I'm sure, across Earth believe in some basic understanding of a transcendent being that created and sustains the universe. So something like that. And most of those people form at least many of their beliefs about God based upon testimony. And I think that just as they form beliefs about the world based upon testimony, and that's justified, simply receiving the testimony itself can be the justification or ground for forming the belief that the testimony itself. So if they testify about God and God's nature, then likewise you can form justified beliefs about God, properly basic. Again, there can be defeaters. There can be objections that arise that can undercut or rebut the testimony you received, in which case you're no longer justified in accepting it. But that's true of all of our beliefs. All of our beliefs are provisional in nature. They're all fallible. But nonetheless, you can form justified beliefs. And so that was the point I was making in my debate. So in that case, what I can do is I can argue, not by invoking the Sensus Divinitatis, which, although I think we may very well have such a cognitive faculty as that, but that is not something in Matt's worldview. It's not something in Tom's worldview. They can look at it as special pleading. They can look at it as ad hoc. But if I say, hey, we all form beliefs by way of testimony, and those beliefs can be properly basic in the right circumstances, then I say, and we can form beliefs in God based upon a properly basic cognitive process. And the fact is that, in my opinion, Tom and Matt could do nothing, in fact, to rebut the claim I had made. I mean, they tried to argue that there were what they didn't call them this, but what I would call undercutting defeaters for the reliability of testimony when it comes to what, I don't know, Tom talked about ultimate metaphysical questions or something. But of course, the interesting irony of that tack, which I think doesn't work at all, but the interesting irony of it is it also undercuts the ability of atheist parents to teach their children atheist beliefs about ultimate reality, and for those children to be justified in forming those beliefs based upon testimony. And ironically, it also undercuts agnostic parents who want to teach their children that we can't know if God exists or not, or we can't form justified beliefs about God. That also would be unjustified. So I think there's some pretty radical implications to their view, and frankly, that's just the beginning of it. But the other thing, I think, with Tom in particular, I think actually both of them, they were kind of wallowing. On the one hand, they wanted to concede that you can form properly basic beliefs by way of testimony. On the other hand, they kept wanting to argue, but it's just so unreliable. And so they were kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth. Either testimony is so unreliable in contrast to, let's say, sense perception or rational intuition or memory or some other cognitive process, that we really can't trust testimony, or it is reliable enough that we indeed can form properly basic beliefs about God and all sorts of other things by way of testimony. So anyway, that's my quick rundown of the debate.